just me at the house when the nice people knocked on the door. I remember that I had a mug of coffee, and I remember settling down on the stoop while we chatted about God, faith, and the Bible. At some point, my parents came home from church, and my visitors left. Oddly, they never returned. But for the next 20 years, my mother told and retold that story. Scot would argue with anyone, she said, even evangelicals. I've told the story before of being raised UU. The truth is, I've learned a lot of things from my church, my childhood church on Cedar Lane outside of D.C., but the Bible was not one of those things. In the recent years, though, I've managed to learn a little. And one of the most curious things I've learned is that even the people that have read the Bible don't really know much about it. In preparing for this morning, I was thinking about that poem by Shelley, Ozymandias. That's why we read it. The idea that we can be so arrogant about our accomplishments and nevertheless have those accomplishments lost to time. Everything passes. Power, monuments, empire. How many tyrants, how many heroes have risen up and fallen away in the last 4,000 years of human history? How many of them believed in their immortality? How many have we forgotten? And then there's this thing, a book. A book that we Unitarian Universalists, as a matter of reflex, look past. I'm reminded of my own past, being stumped on a stoop. I'm reminded of our Article 2 journey also, of being called to live into the future, and I wonder. Just to quickly recap, our Article 2 commission is asking us to consider 6 values to describe our faith and our approach to the world: interdependence, justice, transformation, generosity, equity, and pluralism, right? With love at the center. Values that we say make us different. Values that separate us from other traditions. Values that separate us from the past and lead us into the future. Here's the thing. Being born into this faith is unusual. Most of you are not. And I know that there are many here today who come to us from communities of faith that are quite different. And these people will be happy to tell you that many of those communities put love at the center too. Communities that value deeds over creeds, that privilege the insights of modern science. And I know this because my brother told me. My brother, an Episcopal priest in Madison, has filled my ear when I have gotten all uppity about how cool and different we UUs are. I have been lectured, gently and with love, that our UU values, especially these new values, are just not as uncommon as we believe, or might want to believe. But with love and respect to my brother and to all, if there is one thing that separates our faith tradition from others, it is how big our tents are. Don't get me wrong, the Episcopal Church is a big tent, but this UU tent of ours is more like a market bazaar. We have tents all over the place. Christian UUs, Jewish UUs, Hindu UUs, atheist UUs, spiritualists and scientists, UUs that center the teachings of Islam, neo-paganism, naturalism, and yes, even the Bible. And we do it all in the spirit of curiosity, love, and with the expectation of mutual respect. At least that is the aspiration. So, not love, not interdependence, justice, transformation, generosity, or equity. Many other traditions celebrate those values too. But pluralism, that is different. And we take it very seriously. So today, in that spirit, and in the spirit of curiosity, in the spirit of spiritual defense against the dark arts, and because any free and responsible search for truth and meaning must make space for our past as well as our hopes for the future, and with all due apologies and hope for your forgiveness, today we're going to devote a little bit of time to a most peculiar book and how it came to be: the Bible. My story begins with the observation that this thing we call the Bible wasn't always a whole or single thing. It started to come together into a single thing no earlier than 400 years before the Common Era. That's about when the 5 books of the Torah became realized or recognized as a unit. The next bit, the collection of writings known as the prophets, got settled about 200 years later. The last bit, the collection called the writings, that stabilized another 300 years after that. 500-year span. So together, these 24 books are what our Jewish neighbors call collectively the Hebrew Bible. For Christians, a series of ecumenical councils in the 4th century eventually chose 27 books to make up their New Testament. For the 39 books for their so-called Old Testament, they took the Hebrew Bible, separated out some of the books, and then added a few more. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, the oldest book in either Bible, anybody know? Book of Job, right? Excellent, right? Well done. Winner, winner, chicken dinner in the back. We don't actually have an exact date for that story, but we think it's about 4,000 years old. That would separate it from the youngest book of the Bible by over 2,000 years. That youngest book, for the record, is 2nd Esdras, part of the Apocrypha. And here's my first digression. What are the Apocrypha? I'm so glad you asked. First, understand that there are books that religious leaders liked and continue to like over the generation. And then there are others. These other books, older books, whatever books that they don't like so much, they were separated out. We call those the Apocrypha, a word which means hidden. Books that were excluded from the approved reading list by various leaders and for various reasons. And that brings me to a realization that many readings that us modern folks will find in any randomly selected Bible were just a few of the great many that were in circulation over the many centuries that the Bible has been a thing. At issue, if you will forgive me, was fan fiction. Pseudepigrapha is the fancy word for that. Basically, forgery. Fake St. Paul, fake St. Peter, and so on. Apparently, faking age and authorship of your work was really quite popular back in the day. Some of these fakes were really, really good. 6 letters that were mistakenly attributed to Paul actually made it into the Bible. Oops. Most, however, did not. Some of these were obvious fakes. Some didn't seem old enough. Some were just wacky. The Book of Giants, for example, that's a really good one. But for whatever the reason, these apocrypha were deemed extra and were ultimately not included in the biblical canon. Canon is just a word that we moderns take to mean approved. Anyway, we know of about 54 popular and very widely read books that were ultimately deemed non-canonical. In some versions of what we now call the Bible, the Apocrypha are included as bonus material, usually set between the Old and New Testament. In some Bibles, this bonus material is absent. And just to keep things interesting, in some versions, some Apocrypha is actually canon. What this means for us is that any 2 Bibles over at Barnes & Noble will likely be substantively different one from the other. For example, the Protestant Bible typically includes 80 books. There are only 72 in the Catholic Bible. The Lutheran Bible only includes 66. There are 81, though, in the Orthodox Bible. And over the centuries, we've uncovered other texts, like the Gospel of Mary in 1896. That's really cool. The Marcionite Library at Medinet Mahdi was discovered in 1929. And then in 1945, there was the discovery of the Nag Hammadi. That library was recovered, including the Gospel of Philip, the first and second apocalypses of James, and the Gospel of Thomas, among many others. The point: every one of these books were part of someone's idea of the Bible at some point in history. And those are just the books that we have. There are more that we know once existed. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of the Nazarenes. These three texts we know once existed because they were quoted extensively by other early Christian writers. And then there's the Sayings Gospel of Jesus. This one we know existed by inference. One of the reasons that scholars claim that the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel written is because the Gospels of Matthew and Mark copied stories out of it, word for word. However, Matthew and Luke then added some stuff, word for word quotes that are absent in Mark. This lost list scholars call Q, for the German word Quelle, or source. For decades, many thought that the Gospel of Thomas recovered at Nag Hammadi might be Q, but now that seems unlikely. With all we have, there are at least 4 entire Gospels that we know that have been lost to time. Speaking of lost to time, it is worth remembering that none of the Gospels were written while Jesus was alive. In fact, the oldest text in the New Testament, which is the book of James, was written at least 15 years after the death of Jesus. It's perhaps interesting that Martin Luther deliberately excluded this text from his Geneva Bible. Anyway, after James comes the letters of St. Paul, the apostle writing many of his very definitive letters before he met any of the disciples. And the oldest gospel, Mark, was written some 40 years after Jesus was killed. The newest, John, came as late as 70 after Jesus' death. So here's a question. Anybody here ever play a game of telephone? Imagine a game of telephone that lasts 70 years. If you've played this game, you know it would be wildly unreasonable to assume stuff not added to the stories by later storytellers. Well, what kind of stuff? Another excellent question, and that brings me to my Easter sermon. Stay tuned. But speaking of telephone, it may surprise you to know that a majority of folks didn't know how to read until the 19th century. Luckily for us, you don't have to be able to read a book to be able to copy a book. But not understanding what you're copying is probably why many of the fragments we have show weird errors, where the transcriber clearly lost their place. They misplaced a word, a phrase, an entire page, or inserted brand new words, verses, or stories into the texts they were working on. For example, there is a story found in the Gospel of John, the woman caught in adultery. For reference, this is the "let he who is without sin cast the first stone" parable, right? That entire story magically appears at some point in later fragments. It's completely absent in older ones. In fact, some of them locate that story in various places in the Gospel of John. It's as if someone added a note in a margin, and some later copier just chose to insert that entire marginalia into the main part of the text. And that bit in Corinthians about women being silent in church, completely absent in older fragments. One of the theories is that some scribe was working out a marriage frustration. I'm not kidding. The word sodomite that appears in the King James Version, apparently randomly added. And the name of the angel of darkness, Lucifer, as found in the book of Isaiah, well, apparently that was a typo. The word was accidentally capitalized at some point and then repeated, and it inspired some dude named Dante who wrote a poem. And did you know that the Gospel of Mark has not one but two endings? In one of those endings, there's an extra 11 verses. Why? We have no idea. The challenge scholars have is to recreate the hypothetical original from existing fragments, and to be quite honest, there's good reason to believe they have done an amazing job. But even so, doubts remain. If you want to see those doubts, just pick up any study Bible, check the footnotes at the bottom of every single page. That's where you'll see notes about alternative words found in, quote, other fragments. All in all, we have something like 6,000 fragmentary copies of the New Testament in the original Greek, 10,000 more in Latin, and 6,000 in other various languages. And since we do not have any originals of these individual books of either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, there is no definitive right version. Instead, what we have are thousands and thousands and thousands of arguments that exist between these ancient sources. This word, that word, no word, too many words, not enough words. What we end up with is in our cleaned up store-bought Bible, is a version that basically got the most votes by the translator. So, about translators. Since it was first translated into English, there have been some 900 different English versions. One of my favorite resources, BibleGateway.com, boasts that it has 232 current versions of the Bible to choose from. 232. Now, some of these versions translate word for word. Some translate phrase by phrase. Some translate story by story. Why the difference? Well, some of it has to do with politics, some with dogma, and often it has to do with the way language works. English, with its subject-verb-object structure, just isn't the way ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek writers put their sentences together. Literal translations are, therefore, hard to understand. Idioms, slang, that all gets lost. So does poetics, like alliteration and rhyme. And that's why some modern translators, like those who wrote the Message Bible, for example, have chosen to add back in some of that literary magic that the ancient languages clearly had, even if it means taking some liberties in English. Some, like the New International Version, aim for this imagined middle ground between literal and accessible. But the fact is, none of them are perfect. Language and idiom get outdated. That's why we get updates. The King James Version, published in 1611, got updated to the New King James Version in 1982. The Revised Standard Version, published in 1952, was updated to the New Revised Standard Version in 1989, which was updated to the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition in 2022. And yes, for the record, translation matters. The words virgin, homosexual, and hell are all mistranslations and represent ideas simply not present in the ancient texts. And while those are old errors, new errors keep coming. The English Standard Version, finalized in 2016 by evangelical scholars, intentionally reverses the actual meaning of the text to imply that women are condemned to unhappy marriages because of original sin. I could go on all morning. Let's find a way to bring this home. My point isn't that the Bible is flawed, silly, anachronistic, or useless. To be very clear, I am not a Bible debunker or a new atheist foot soldier intent on deconstructing Christian faith out of existence. I'm a priest. I was born into a faith tradition sourced from 19th century American Congregationalism. My ancestors, both literal and liturgical, were Puritans. Christianity is serious business to me. And not just because once upon a time I got schooled by evangelicals while I was hungover on my parents' front stoop. I mean, not just. And I bring up all this curious stuff about the Bible, not because I'm trying for smug superiority, for the record. I don't have to try. It just comes naturally. I'm kidding. Lord, I apologize. My point for this audience here is that the Bible is a real, organic, and human thing. It has a character, a nature, a history that is ambiguous. And with everything else that we're told about the Bible, those facts are important, and they are too often overlooked, most often by those with dangerous or foolish agendas. Now, the truth is, I love this stuff. The Bible is fascinating to me. There's literally nothing like it in the history of the world. Not the Buddhist canon, which is way larger than the Bible. Not the Vedas of Vedanta Hinduism, which are way older than even the oldest books of the Bible. The Bible, or more properly, whatever it is that we somewhat arbitrarily choose to call the Bible, that was born of a people in the middle of calamity and conquest at the hands of empires now as lost to time as fabled Ozymandias. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. With defeat and despair clinging to them like grave dust, these ancient ancestors collected and edited and redacted and told their stories to not just make sense of the world, but to make sense of themselves. Their stories are heartbreaking, inspiring, awful, and often bewildering. And people have carried these stories, identified with these stories, read themselves into these stories ever since. As UUs, we don't do much with the Bible, not anymore. We used to. But as a movement, we pulled away from tradition and replaced those idols with others, lifting up reason, truth, and logic. And that is our story. Even talking about the Bible like I have this morning is sufficient to cause anxiety and dismay. But this year, our pluralist aspiration is asking us to reconsider, to acknowledge that there are those already here, or those who might one day find a home here, good people who might find the good book to be inspiring, meaningful, and good. So maybe you could put it this way. While our faith tradition centers reason, truth, and logic, it doesn't center only that. The Bible is subject to the same curiosity, love, and expectation of mutual respect that any of our sources are. In short, we argue with everybody and everything, no exceptions. We are the children of Jacob. We are that child who once upon a time in the story of Genesis wrestled with God himself down by the river. And our ongoing struggle, our ongoing search for truth and meaning has been our privilege and our blessing. And I believe our story is worth centering too, because there has been debate and scholarship and disagreement about the fundamentals of faith, especially the meaning, truth, and value of sacred texts, for as long as there have been sacred texts. And that brings me to today's shameless plug. You were invited to join our sacred text study group. That group meets in the common room the second Tuesday of every month, which happens to be this Thursday, and yes, all are welcome. As for me, I firmly and freely acknowledge that my wholehearted embrace of the tools of modern scholarship will likely earn me the title heretic. So what? If asking questions, seeking truth, and challenging answers I uncover marks me as heretic, then heretic is a fine label, one right and proper for all curious and loving people. We UUs say that we don't have to think alike to love alike, and that is a good thing because some of the texts we're supposed to be working with, thinking alike seems thoroughly unlikely, but that is okay. In fact, that brings me to my one big conclusion. Given all of this history, I want to say that if there is a God, who's going to be big mad at us in some promised life to come, I cannot help but believe that we will be judged on something else, like how we treat each other, and not because of our perfectly normal, totally natural, and completely justified curiosity for the stupendously obvious and totally human aspects of this astonishing, startling, challenging, and altogether marvelous collection of drama we call the Bible. Amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.